Africa's poverty has a wide range of root causes that people are often unaware of. While many assume corruption, colonization, or foreign interference as the main reasons, they overlook what allows these situations to happen in the first place. Today we will time travel back to the 13th century and explore how African countries were once wealthy and mighty. We will investigate why in the centuries since then, Africa has become mired in poverty while other foreign colonies have prospered. To do this, let's take a look at what happened in 14th century in East Africa was connected to Indian Ocean trade, and West Africa was home to Mansa Musa, the wealthiest man in history. Unfortunately, many historians assume that African history is limited to mummies and pyramids, something which is far from the truth. It is important to remember that for most of history, much of Africa was as well connected to the rest of the world empires. So what changed? Well, in the 14th century, Africa's prosperity began to fall behind that of the rest of the world. This was because of two external forces, the Ottoman Empire and the Western European Empire. The Ottomans had a long-standing practice of capturing people for slavery, with raids on villages and towns to get their captives. The easiest and cheapest place to get new slaves was Eastern Africa. Slave traders capitalized on the East African slave trade, making a considerable amount of money by either buying or forcibly capturing individuals from the region to sell them to the Ottomans. Sadly, this cruel and inhumane practice was prevalent until the 19th century. Something similar was happening with Western European empires. At first, European traders came to Africa to trade salt in exchange for gold and ivory. Later, Europeans sailed around Africa to go to Asia. After realizing that West Africa was an ideal location for getting supplies to and from Asia, European traders began attempting to cross the Atlantic in order to directly access East Asia. In doing so, they accidentally discovered the Indies Americans colonies instead. These colonies were supposed to have the same system of government as that of Europe, with nobility barons, clergy, knights, and peasants. But those Europeans had a problem. The Native Americans who were supposed to become the new peasants were dying from diseases like measles, bubonic plague, and smallpox. Well, dead peasant is an unproductive. The need for laborers in the American colonies was met by sourcing from the West African slave markets. Although West Africa had its own form of slavery, often a slave would be treated similarly to a non-slave with equivalent rights. Rather than having their children become enslaved, West African families willingly sold to Europeans to be used as slaves. This enabled them to remain part of the family structure, instead of being excluded, and thus resulted in European traders looking to Africa for slaves because their own gold mines were drying up in the 15th century, and they were looking for a new way to earn money. But how do you get new slaves? Well, you go to war for them. Various African countries went to war with their neighbors, captured their citizens, and then sold those citizens to the Europeans. Prominent slave countries were the Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, the Bono State, and the Songhai Empire. From the perspective of African rulers, this seemed like a good deal. They were weakening their rivals while earning lots of money in the process. And so over time, slavery changed from a relatively small market, where slaves had rights, into a large system of warfare, where slaves became property to be sold to the highest bidder. This evolved into a system where slave traders would go to Africa to buy slaves and put as many as they could fit onto their ships. They would then sail to the America, where those slaves were sold to work to death in the fields. The slave traders would buy raw materials such as sugarcane, cotton, or cocoa from the slaves' owners, and then sail to Europe to sell these for a profit. In Europe, those materials were turned into finished products like rum, clothing, or weapons. The traders then bought those manufactured goods and sailed back to Africa to sell those manufactured goods and use the profits to buy new slaves. This was a good deal for everybody except the slaves. The Americans received slaves to use in their plantations. The Europeans received raw materials, and the West Africans received manufactured goods, and the plight of the slaves was not an issue to any of them, while at times Europeans tried taking slaves by force. This always failed because the African kingdoms were far too strong at the time, and so they maintained friendly relations with whichever country was willing to sell slaves. Over the centuries, empires collapsed into civil wars. Such happened in the Kingdom of Congo, which fell apart into various factions. Each of those factions needed weapons and money to fund their war effort. and so they captured slaves from other parts of the former Kingdom of Congo and sold them to Portuguese traders. As the Europeans found more and more colonies in the America, the more slaves could be sold, and the richer the traders became. And this trade had a long-term effect on the economies of Africa, both in West Africa as well as East Africa with the Ottomans. Because before industrialization, the economy of a country was determined by the amount of people living in the country. The more people you had, the larger your economy was. And if you had a large economy, then you could have a small portion of your population focus on producing things other than food. In Europe, artisans were renowned for creating a wide range of products including alcohol, steel, guns, and cigars. It took centuries for those industries to fully mature. But in Africa, these industries never matured like they did in the rest of the world. Because in Africa, craftspeople were enslaved, and this had a tremendous impact on the African economies. While European, Asian, and American industries kept growing and kept improving, Africa's industries stagnated, and soon they could no longer compete with European and Asian imports. And the African industries became small and insignificant because you could buy better and cheaper products from Asian and European markets. But you might be asking yourself, why did the Africans go along with this? Well, because they had to. When you have several warlike empires surrounding you, you yourself have to invest in a strong military to protect yourself. But if you put more money in the military, it means there is less money for you to spend on your own economy. So if an African leader realized what was going on, they couldn't invest in industries because they had to protect themselves. And so all the way into the 19th century, Africa's economies were slowly declining because the slave trade slowly destroyed the African economies, while making a huge profit for those who captured and sold slaves. But why did Western Europeans and the Ottomans weaken Africa for hundreds of years? Well, because it was convenient for the people in charge at that time. It wasn't some grand plan, but instead, each government, trader, and company saw an opportunity in Africa to earn profit. This profit came at the expense of African long-term wealth, with most of the people involved probably not even realizing this. And when a particular region becomes weaker, there are always the strong, who will exploit the weak. And in the 19th century, 3 major events happened that would solidify African poverty. The first was the end of slavery. All of a sudden, African slave traders were losing customers because slavery was becoming illegal across the world. And this was a big problem for African countries because their economies relied on exporting slaves and importing foreign goods. But now they lost their main source of income, and because Africa had not built up any other industries because of the slave trade, it did not have another source of income with which it could trade with the outside world. So Africans could no longer buy many of the goods and tools they relied on, and as a result, the African economies slowly collapsed in the 19th century. The second major event in the 19th century was industrialization. Europeans and Americans started to outproduce the rest of the world. Africa became insignificant in world affairs by the middle of the 19th century, and many of the stereotypes about Africans, such as that they have no history, no established government, and various racist beliefs came about in this time period when Africa had become weak, with little to offer the outside world, and the outside world taking little interest in Africa. The third major event happened in the 1870s, with Africa's economy in shambles and European industrialization in full swing. Europe all of a sudden had the ability to transport vast amounts of heavy materials across oceans. Before, it would not be profitable to transport heavy ores from Africa to Europe because the technology simply wasn't available yet to make it profitable. But steam technology meant trains, steamboats, and factories that could transport and produce goods at a profit. And in 1871, the King of Belgium decided that Belgium should have a colony, looked at the world map and noticed that Africa was both weak and available. And so once again, the strong took advantage of the weak. Soon other European nations joined, and almost all of Africa was colonized by Western and Southern European empires. This had 3 significant results for Africa. First is the increased poverty. European colonizers cared little for the people living in the colony. Africans were driven out of the most fertile regions to make space for European settlers. Plantations were built for Africans to work, and for Europeans to own. And the taxes Africans paid were rarely spent on improving their lives, but instead on continuing their own oppression. The European colonizers were only interested in extracting wealth from their colonies by constructing roads, railroads, and ports to transport raw materials to Europe and North America. In essence, whatever wealth Africans had were systematically taken from them and handed over to European settlers. A prominent example is the Congo Free State, where they worked millions of people to their deaths. By the way, if you're curious what the Free stands for, in the Congo Free State, it meant free of oversight. So the rulers of the colony could exploit the locals without any interference. The second is the infrastructure, which was designed specifically to transport raw materials to their European overlords. The first president of Togo said it quite well. The effects of the policy of the colonial powers has been the economic isolation of peoples who live side by side, in some instances within a few miles of each other. Although I can call Paris from my office telephone here in Lomé, I cannot place a call to Lagos in Nigeria, only 250 miles away again, while it takes a short time to send an airmail letter to Paris. It takes several days for the same latter to reach Accra, a mere 132 miles away. Railroads rarely connect at international boundaries. Roads have been constructed from the coast inland, but very few join economic centers of trade. The productive central regions of Togo, Benin, and Ghana are as remote from each other as if they were on separate continents. And the third result was that by replacing all the African leaders with European leaders, that Africa was losing vital skills in terms of governing themselves, such as business managers, government leaders, or accountants, as well as practical skills such as mechanics, construction, workers, or medical professionals. And that was a problem when Africans started demanding their independence after World War II, when protests, riots, and rebellions popped up across the continent, until the colonizers realized that a few million Europeans simply couldn't control over 200 million Africans if those Africans refused to cooperate. And so between 1945 and 1975, almost every African country became independent.
In Ghana, the handover of power from the British government went off smoothly and with dignity.
At the time, it was thought that if Africans would once again rule Africa, that wealth would follow soon. But this didn't happen. But why not? History has shown us that former colonies can become wealthy countries such as New Zealand, Ireland, or South Korea. Yet not a single country in Africa is what we call a developed country. And the reason for this is the way in which the colonizers left Africa. Because when people don't have the skills to run a country, when communities don't connect to each other, and when prosperity is already rare, it becomes very difficult for the leaders of that country to bring prosperity to that country. But at the same time, leaders of African independence movements promise the African people prosperity after independence. So how were African leaders going to fulfill this promise of wealth and prosperity? Well, for most African countries, the solution was an economic system called African socialism. The way this system works is that many industries would be controlled by the national government, such as mining, construction, plantations, etc. It would then use all of the nation's resources to industrialize, because at the time, manufacturing jobs paid higher salaries than farming jobs, and so decided that the best way for Africa to become rich was to replace low-paying jobs in agriculture and mining with high-paying jobs in factories.